The pre-dawn darkness hung heavy over Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat hunched over intelligence reports in his sparse military quarters. At 37, his weathered face bore the indelible marks of a soldier who had witnessed too much violence, made too many impossible decisions, and carried the weight of a nation's hopes on his shoulders. The fluorescent light above cast harsh shadows across the documents scattered before him. Casualty reports from the northern provinces where insurgent groups continued their relentless campaign of terror, economic projections that painted an increasingly bleak picture of Burkina Faso's finances, and diplomatic cables from international partners growing impatient with the country's instability. Sleep had become a luxury Traoré could rarely afford. Since assuming the role of interim president following the military intervention 8 months earlier, every hour seemed to bring new crises demanding immediate attention. The insurgency in the north had displaced over 2 million people. Youth unemployment exceeded 60% in urban areas. International mining companies were threatening to suspend operations due to security concerns. And through it all, the weight of legitimacy hung over his administration like a storm cloud. He had not been elected by the people, but had inherited power through circumstances beyond anyone's control. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Lieutenant Konate entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through years of loyal service dating back to their days fighting rebels in the eastern provinces. The young officer's normally composed demeanor seemed strained, and Traoré immediately sensed something unusual in his approach. "Sir," Konate began, his voice carrying an undertone of urgency that made Traoré look up from his papers. "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent and will only speak to you directly." Traoré rubbed his tired eyes, glancing at the clock on the wall. 5:30 in the morning was an unusual time for unscheduled visits, especially ones demanding such specificity. "Who is it?" "A forest ranger from the eastern region. Drove through the night to get here. Wouldn't give me details, but he seems—" Konate paused, searching for the right word. "Frightened, sir." But determined, the combination intrigued Traoré. In his experience, rangers were typically composed individuals accustomed to working alone in challenging environments. What could frighten such a person enough to drive through dangerous territory in the middle of the night? "Send him in." The man who entered bore all the hallmarks of someone who had spent his professional life in Burkina Faso's wilderness areas. His faded green uniform, standard issue for the forestry service, showed the wear of constant field use. Dust coated his boots and clothing, suggesting recent travel from remote areas. Most tellingly, his eyes held the alert wariness of someone accustomed to navigating both natural and human dangers. He saluted with military precision, a gesture that spoke to either former military service or deep respect for military protocol. "Captain Traoré, thank you for seeing me. I'm Ranger Ouedraogo from the Palma Reserve in the eastern forests." "At ease, Ranger." Traoré gestured to a chair across from his desk. "What brings you all the way to Ouagadougou at this hour?" Ouedraogo glanced nervously at Lieutenant Konate, then back to Traoré. The hesitation suggested information sensitive enough to require the highest levels of discretion. "Sir, I've discovered something that I believe threatens national security. A large-scale illegal logging operation targeting our most valuable protected species." Traoré leaned forward, his attention fully engaged. Burkina Faso's forests represented a critical component of the country's environmental and economic stability. The eastern woodlands, in particular, harbored some of West Africa's last remaining stands of commercially valuable hardwood species. "Who's behind it?" "That's why I came directly to you, sir." Ouedraogo's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "The operation involves high-level government officials, including people who should be protecting these resources, not exploiting them." The ranger reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, placing it carefully on Traoré's desk. "This is a shipping manifest I found in an abandoned logging camp. They're collecting timber at a warehouse near Fada and Gourma before transporting it across the border. According to this, a major convoy is scheduled to move in 48 hours. Traoré studied the document with growing alarm. The quantities listed were staggering, enough rare hardwood to fill 20 large trucks, worth tens of millions of dollars on international black markets. The destination notation made his jaw clench, Dragon Pearl Enterprises, Guangzhou, China. What species are they targeting? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The most valuable ones, sir. African blackwood, rosewood, mahogany. Trees that have stood for centuries, survived droughts, wars, everything. They're taking them all. Ouedraogo's voice cracked slightly with emotion. At this rate, there won't be anything left for our children. Traoré thought of his own childhood in rural Burkina Faso, playing beneath ancient baobab trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the coming of colonial rule and the birth of independence. Those trees had been constants in a world of perpetual change, providing shade, food, medicine, and spiritual significance to countless generations. The idea that such irreplaceable heritage was being reduced to mere commodity for export filled him with a cold rage. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" he asked. Ouedraogo shook his head emphatically. "No, sir. After I found this evidence, 2 of my ranger colleagues disappeared while investigating the same operation. My supervisor told me to drop the investigation immediately. When I refused and continued gathering information, someone left a warning note on my vehicle with a bullet placed on top." The pattern was disturbingly familiar to Traoré. Intimidation, disappearances, official pressure to cease investigations, all classic indicators of high-level corruption with serious money at stake. The fact that government officials were involved made the situation exponentially more dangerous and complex. Standing up, Traoré walked to the window overlooking the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. Dawn was beginning to break, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The city was slowly coming to life, vendors setting up roadside stalls, early commuters beginning their journeys, children walking to school, all of them depending, directly or indirectly, on the natural resources that were apparently being systematically plundered by those entrusted to protect them. "You did the right thing coming to me," Traoré said finally, turning back to face Ouedraogo. "But this information doesn't leave this room until we decide how to act on it." He looked to Lieutenant Konate. "Find Major Sanu and Captain Dao. Tell them to report here immediately. No details over radio or telephone." As Konate hurried out to locate the other officers, Traoré returned his attention to the ranger. "I need you to show me exactly where this warehouse is located and the route this convoy will take." Ouedraogo nodded and spread a detailed topographic map across the desk. As they bent over it together, Traoré felt a familiar tension building in his shoulders, the same sensation that had preceded every major military operation he had ever commanded. But this time the enemy wasn't foreign insurgents or rebel groups. This time the threat came from within Burkina Faso itself. "How many trees have they already taken?" Traoré asked quietly. "Hundreds, sir. Some over 200 years old. Ancient trees that survived the slave trade, colonial exploitation, independence wars, and decades of drought." Ouedraogo's voice carried the weight of witnessed destruction. "The ecological damage will take generations to heal if it ever does." Traoré nodded grimly, his resolve hardening. "Not if I can help it. We're going to stop this convoy and expose everyone involved, regardless of their position or connections." Within an hour, Traoré's inner circle had assembled in the secure briefing room adjacent to his office. Major Sanu, his most trusted field commander, arrived first, a compact, intense man whose tactical brilliance had been proven in numerous counterinsurgency operations. Captain Dao followed shortly after, bringing with him the methodical approach to logistics that had kept their forces supplied and operational. In some of the most challenging environments in West Africa, Traoré outlined the situation with characteristic directness, presenting Ouedraogo's evidence and explaining the potential implications. The room fell silent as the officers absorbed the magnitude of what they were confronting. "Sir," Major Sanu spoke first, his voice carefully controlled, "if government ministers are involved, this operation could be interpreted as a military coup against civilian authority." It was a valid concern, and one that Traoré had been wrestling with since Ouedraogo's arrival. The delicate balance between military and civilian power in Burkina Faso had been a source of instability for decades. Any action that could be construed as the military overstepping its bounds risked triggering a constitutional crisis. "Major," Traoré replied. My oath as an officer was to defend Burkina Faso against all enemies, foreign and domestic. If evidence shows that officials are systematically looting our national resources for personal profit, that constitutes a threat to national security that transcends normal political considerations. Captain Dow leaned forward, studying the shipping manifest. The timing suggests they're trying to move this cargo quickly, possibly because they suspect increased scrutiny. That works to our advantage. It means they haven't had time to perfect their security arrangements. Ouedraogo, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. Sir, there's something else. The manifest shows this is shipment number 47. If they've been operating at this scale for an extended period, we're looking at environmental damage worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The number hit Traoré like a physical blow. 47 shipments of rare hardwood represented not just environmental destruction, but a systematic transfer of wealth from one of the world's poorest countries to international markets. While Burkina families struggled to afford basic necessities, their natural heritage was being converted into luxury furniture for wealthy consumers half a world away. We need to intercept this convoy, Traoré decided. But we also need to ensure we gather enough evidence to prosecute everyone involved and dismantle the entire network. Major Sanu nodded and pulled out his tactical planning materials. If we're going to do this, we need to choose our interception point carefully, somewhere that gives us tactical advantage while minimizing the risk to the evidence. They spent the next 2 hours developing a comprehensive operational plan. The convoy would follow a predictable route from the warehouse near Fada Ngourma to the border crossing at Kanchari. The most vulnerable point would be the Singu Valley, a narrow pass between rocky outcroppings where the road constricted to a single lane. There, a small team could establish an effective roadblock while maintaining high ground positions. We'll need men we can trust absolutely, Traoré emphasized. This operation must remain confidential until we're ready to move. Captain Dow had been quiet during most of the planning session, but now he raised a critical concern. Sir, what about the international implications? If we seize a shipment bound for China, there could be diplomatic consequences. Traoré considered this carefully. China was Burkina Faso's largest trading partner and the source of significant infrastructure investment. However, he also knew that the Chinese government had been increasingly sensitive to international criticism regarding environmental issues and was likely to distance itself from illegal operations once they became public. The evidence suggests this is a private criminal enterprise, not a government-to-government arrangement, he concluded. If anything, exposing it may strengthen our relationship with China by demonstrating our commitment to legitimate trade practices. As the planning session concluded, Traoré made one final decision that surprised his officers. I'll be accompanying the operation personally, Major Sanu immediately objected. Sir, that's an unnecessary risk. Your presence isn't required for tactical success. It's required for political legitimacy, Traoré countered. If this operation goes wrong, I need to be there to take responsibility. If it succeeds, my presence will demonstrate that this isn't a rogue military action, but a decision made at the highest levels of government. The logic was sound, even if the risk was considerable. In Burkina Faso's complex political environment, the personal involvement of the interim president would carry significant weight in justifying the operation's legitimacy. Very well, sir, Sanu accepted reluctantly. But we do this by the book. Full tactical precautions, secure communications, and extraction plans if things go wrong. As the meeting broke up, Traoré felt the familiar pre-operation mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Every major decision carried the potential for unintended consequences, and the stakes of this particular mission extended far beyond the immediate tactical objectives. Success could expose and dismantle a major corruption network while protecting irreplaceable natural resources. Failure could destabilize his administration and leave the illegal logging operation intact. That afternoon, Traoré took an unusual step for a head of state. He drove to the outskirts of Ouagadougou to visit a small community that had been directly affected by deforestation. The village of Nabariga had once been surrounded by dense woodland, but recent years had seen progressive clearing for both legal and illegal timber operations. The village chief, An elderly man named Yamba welcomed Traoré with the formal courtesy due to a head of state, but his eyes held the weariness of someone who had witnessed the gradual destruction of his community's environment. "The trees that shaded my grandfather's childhood are gone," Yamba explained as they walked through areas that had once been forested. "The springs that flowed year-round have dried up. Our children must walk farther each day to find clean water." Traoré listened carefully, absorbing the human cost of environmental destruction. These weren't abstract policy issues, but direct threats to the survival and well-being of Burkina Faso's rural communities. "What would it mean to your people if we could stop the illegal cutting and begin replanting?" he asked. Yamba's weathered face brightened slightly. "It would mean hope, Mr. President. Hope that our grandchildren might see the return of the forests that sustained our ancestors for centuries." As Traoré drove back to Ouagadougou, Yamba's words echoed in his mind. The upcoming operation wasn't just about intercepting a convoy or prosecuting corrupt officials. It was about preserving the possibility of environmental recovery for future generations. The following evening, as the sun set over Ouagadougou, Traoré and his carefully selected team began their journey eastward. He had chosen to travel in 2 unmarked civilian vehicles to avoid attracting attention. Major Sanu rode with him in the lead vehicle, while Captain Dao followed with 3 trusted soldiers and Ranger Ouedraogo in a second car. The roads leading away from the capital were in poor condition, forcing them to travel slowly as they navigated potholes and washed-out sections. This gave Traoré time to contemplate the magnitude of what they were attempting. In a few hours, they would either deal a significant blow to organized environmental crime or find themselves in a firefight with well-armed criminals backed by corrupt officials. "Sir," Major Sanu spoke as they drove through the darkness, "I've been thinking about the intelligence Ouedraogo provided. The level of organization and the international connections suggest this isn't just about timber. Operations this sophisticated usually involve multiple criminal activities." Traoré nodded, having reached similar conclusions. "Drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, possibly human trafficking. The same networks that can move illegal timber across borders can transport anything else that generates profit." This realization added another dimension to their mission. They weren't just protecting forests. They were potentially disrupting a multifaceted criminal enterprise that threatened Burkina Faso's security in numerous ways. As they approached the surveillance position Ouedraogo had identified, Traoré's radio crackled to life. Lieutenant Konate, who had remained in Ouagadougou to coordinate communications, reported that the warehouse near Fada Ngourma showed increased activity. Multiple vehicles had been observed arriving after sunset, and local informants reported sounds of heavy machinery operating through the night. "They're loading the convoy," Ouedraogo confirmed from the second vehicle. "Tomorrow night, they'll begin moving toward the border." The team established their observation post on a hilltop overlooking the warehouse complex. Through night vision equipment, they could clearly see the scale of the operation. Dozens of workers were transferring massive logs from temporary storage areas into large trucks designed for long-distance transport. Floodlights illuminated the scene, giving it an almost industrial appearance despite its location in rural Burkina Faso. "Count the vehicles," Traoré instructed Sanu, who was operating high-powered binoculars. 17 trucks so far, with more logs being moved from storage. "Each truck appears to be carrying 4 to 6 massive logs." Sanu paused, calculating. "Conservative estimate, each truck is carrying timber worth between 2 and 4 million CFA francs at international market prices." The numbers were staggering. Even at conservative estimates, they were looking at cargo worth over 40 million CFA francs, more than most Burkinabe would earn in several lifetimes, extracted from their national forests and destined for foreign markets. More disturbing was the level of security surrounding the operation. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and several military-style vehicles were positioned strategically around the warehouse. This wasn't a small-time smuggling operation, but a major criminal enterprise with the resources and connections to operate with apparent impunity. "Sir," Ouedraogo whispered urgently, pointing toward a group of figures near the largest truck. The man in civilian clothes directing the loading, that's Chen Wei, the Dragon Pearl Enterprises representative. I recognize him from surveillance photos we took during earlier investigations. Traoré studied the figure through his own binoculars. Chen appeared to be in his 40s, well-dressed despite the remote location and clearly in charge of the operation. His presence confirmed that this was indeed an international smuggling operation, not merely domestic theft of timber. And the man in uniform next to him? Traoré asked, focusing on a figure in what appeared to be Burkinabe military dress. Ouedraogo's intake of breath was audible. Colonel Diakite, commander of the Eastern Regional Forces. He's supposed to be responsible for preventing exactly this kind of illegal activity. The identification hit Traoré like a physical blow. Colonel Diakite was a respected officer with over 20 years of service, someone Traoré had personally commended for his role in counterinsurgency operations. To see him collaborating with international timber smugglers represented a betrayal not just of duty, but of everything the military claimed to stand for. That explains the heavy security, Major Sanu observed grimly. With military protection, they can operate without fear of interference from local authorities. As dawn approached, the loading operation began winding down. The convoy was nearly complete. 17 massive trucks loaded with irreplaceable hardwood, protected by military-grade security, and destined for international markets that would ask no questions about the timber's origins. Traoré made the decision to return to Ouagadougou to finalize their interception plans. They had seen enough to confirm the scale and significance of the operation. Now they needed to ensure they were prepared for what was likely to be a serious confrontation with well-armed and desperate criminals. The drive back to the capital gave him time to consider the broader implications of what they had witnessed. This wasn't an isolated case of corruption, but evidence of a systematic failure of governance. How many other such operations were currently underway? How many had already succeeded in stripping Burkina Faso of its natural heritage? By the time they reached Ouagadougou, Traoré had made a commitment that extended far beyond stopping a single convoy. This operation would mark the beginning of a comprehensive campaign against environmental crime and the corruption that enabled it. The following afternoon, Traoré and his team positioned themselves at the Singou Valley, the narrow pass they had selected for the convoy interception. The location offered significant tactical advantages: high ground on both sides of the road, multiple positions for concealment, and terrain that would make it difficult for the convoy to turn around or disperse once committed to the route. Lieutenant Konate had arrived earlier with a specialized team of 12 soldiers, all personally selected for their reliability and discretion. They had spent the morning preparing defensive positions and establishing the roadblock using felled trees positioned to look like natural obstacles while actually being carefully placed to channel the convoy into the optimal interception zone. Radio check, Major Sanu coordinated, ensuring all positions could communicate effectively. The success of the operation would depend largely on precise timing and coordination between multiple elements. As evening approached, scouts positioned along the route reported the convoy's departure from the warehouse. 17 trucks, as expected, accompanied by at least 4 additional vehicles carrying security personnel. The entire formation stretched over nearly a kilometer, moving slowly on the rough rural roads. Movement confirmed, came the radio report. Large convoy proceeding eastward, estimated arrival at interception point in 90 minutes. Traoré felt the familiar pre-combat tension settling over him. Every detail had been planned and rehearsed, but combat situations had a way of developing in unexpected directions. The key was maintaining flexibility while executing the core mission: stop the convoy, secure the evidence, and minimize casualties on all sides. Remember, he addressed his team over the radio, our objective is to preserve evidence and ensure arrests, not to eliminate threats. Use minimum necessary force and prioritize the safety of the timber cargo. The wait seemed endless, but eventually distant headlights appeared through the valley approach. The convoy moved cautiously, drivers clearly aware they were entering terrain where an ambush would be most likely. Security vehicles had positioned themselves at the front and rear of the formation, with armed personnel visible in each truck's cab. Convoy in sight, reported the forward observer. Security appears heavy. multiple armed personnel per vehicle. As the lead truck approached the roadblock, Traoré could see the driver's moment of recognition, the sudden realization that the fallen trees weren't natural obstacles but a deliberate barrier. The driver immediately stopped and began backing up, but the narrow road and the length of the convoy made quick maneuvering impossible. "This is the Burkina military," Traoré announced through a bullhorn, his voice echoing off the rocky walls of the valley. "You are transporting illegally harvested timber. Shut off your engines and step away from the vehicles with your hands visible." The response was immediate and hostile. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions as security personnel opened fire on Traoré's positions. The sound of automatic weapons echoed through the valley, punctuated by the sharper cracks of sniper rifles and the distinctive thump of grenades being launched. "Return fire. But watch your targets," Traoré ordered, drawing his own weapon. "Protect the timber cargo." The firefight that followed was intense but brief. Traoré's team held superior positions and had the advantage of preparation, while the convoy's security force was caught in an exposed position with limited cover. Within 20 minutes, the organized resistance had largely collapsed. "Cease fire," Traoré commanded, as the last of the security personnel either surrendered or fled into the darkness. "Secure the vehicles and check for casualties." The aftermath revealed the full extent of what they had intercepted. Each truck carried between 4 and 6 massive logs of African blackwood, rosewood, and mahogany, trees that had taken centuries to grow and were now irreplaceable in their original ecosystem. The timber represented not just monetary value, but biological heritage that had been stolen from future generations of Burkina. More valuable than the timber itself, however, was the intelligence they had captured. Chen Wei, the Dragon Pearl Enterprises representative, had been arrested along with a briefcase containing detailed records of the smuggling operation. Colonel Diakite had attempted to flee but was captured after a brief pursuit through the rocky terrain. "Sir," Major Sanu reported, "we've got shipping records, financial documents, and what appears to be a complete list of government officials involved in the operation." Traoré examined the documents by flashlight, his anger growing with each page. The corruption network extended throughout multiple ministries and included customs officials, forestry service administrators, and military officers across the eastern region. This single convoy represented just a small fraction of an ongoing systematic looting of Burkina Faso's natural resources. "How many shipments has this network moved?" he asked Chen Wei directly. The Chinese businessman initially refused to answer, but when presented with the evidence of his involvement, he eventually provided limited cooperation. "This is shipment 49, he admitted. "We've been operating for 18 months. 49 shipments." Traoré calculated quickly. If each convoy carried similar cargo, the total value of illegally harvested timber would exceed 2 billion CFA francs. Meanwhile, schools lacked textbooks, hospitals lacked medicines, and infrastructure projects remained unfinished due to insufficient government revenues. Colonel Diakite proved more defiant. "You don't understand what you're interfering with, Traoré," he said. "This operation provides employment for hundreds of people and brings foreign currency into the country. It provides employment for criminals and brings foreign currency into private bank accounts," Traoré replied coldly. "While our forests are stripped bare and our communities lose their environmental foundation." As dawn broke over the Singu Valley, Traoré surveyed the scene of the successful operation. 17 trucks of illegal timber had been seized, along with extensive documentation of the corruption network that had enabled the smuggling operation. Multiple arrests had been made, including high-level officials who had betrayed their public trust for personal profit. But even as he felt satisfaction at the operation's success, Traoré was sobered by the scale of the problem they had uncovered. This network had operated for 18 months with apparent impunity, moving millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable resources out of Burkina Faso. How many other such networks existed? How much of their natural heritage had already been lost? The convoy interception made headlines across Burkina Faso within hours. Traoré had ensured that carefully selected journalists were present to document the seized timber and witness the arrests, making it impossible for corrupt officials to suppress or minimize the story. Public reaction was immediate and powerful, a mixture of outrage at the betrayal by trusted officials and pride that their interim president had personally led the operation to stop the environmental crime. However, the political consequences were swift and severe. By midday, Traoré was facing organized opposition from multiple directions. Several cabinet ministers with connections to those arrested began questioning the legality of the operation, suggesting that the interim president had overstepped his constitutional authority. International pressure also materialized quickly, with Chinese commercial interests expressing concern about the treatment of their personnel and cargo. The Chinese embassy has requested an immediate meeting. Lieutenant Konaté reported as Traoré reviewed the evidence seized from the convoy. They're claiming that the arrest of Chen Wei was improper and demanding his immediate release. Traoré wasn't surprised by the diplomatic pressure. International timber trafficking involved significant money and powerful interests that wouldn't hesitate to use political influence to protect their operations. However, he was prepared for such challenges. Schedule the meeting for this afternoon, he decided, and ensure that the complete evidence file is released to the media before then. Once the documents are public, it will be much harder to claim this was a legitimate business operation. The seized documents revealed a corruption network of staggering scope. Financial records showed payments totaling over 800 million CFA francs made to government officials over the previous 18 months. Shipping manifests detailed 49 previous convoys, each carrying between 15 and 25 massive logs of protected species. Communication records included coded messages between Dragon Pearl Enterprises and officials in the Ministry of Environment, Customs Service, and regional military commands. Most damning of all were photographs and video recordings that showed government ministers personally inspecting timber shipments and meeting with known international smugglers. The evidence left no room for claims of innocent involvement or lack of awareness. "Sir?" Major Sanu entered the secure room where Traoré was reviewing documents. "General Tay has called an emergency meeting of the military high command. He's claiming that your operation was unauthorized and could destabilize civilian military relations. General Tay was the most senior military officer in Burkina Faso and had initially supported Traoré's assumption of interim presidential authority. His opposition represented a serious threat to the stability of the administration and potentially to Traoré's personal safety. What's his specific objection?" Traoré asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "He's arguing that military operations against civilian officials require prior authorization from the full cabinet, and that acting without such authorization constitutes insubordination." Sanu paused. "There's also intelligence suggesting he may have financial connections to the timber smuggling network." The revelation didn't entirely surprise Traoré. Corruption networks typically included military protection, and General Tay commanded sufficient resources to facilitate large-scale smuggling operations. His opposition to the convoy interception might be motivated by self-interest as much as institutional concerns. "Major," Traoré decided, "I want you to conduct a discreet investigation of General Tay's financial records and activities. If he's compromised by involvement in environmental crime, we need to know before he can take action against us." That afternoon's meeting with Chinese embassy officials proved as challenging as expected. The economic attaché, speaking on behalf of the ambassador, expressed formal displeasure with the arrest of Chen Wei and the seizure of Dragon Pearl Enterprises cargo. "Captain Traoré," the attaché began diplomatically, "we understand your commitment to environmental protection, but this matter could have been handled through proper diplomatic channels rather than military action." Traoré had prepared carefully for this conversation. "Mr. Attaché, the evidence clearly shows that Dragon Pearl Enterprises was operating outside both Burkinabe law and Chinese regulations. The Chinese government has itself implemented strict controls on timber imports to prevent exactly this kind of illegal trade." The statement was accurate. China had indeed strengthened its regulations on timber imports in response to international pressure regarding environmental destruction. The Chinese government would find it difficult to defend a company that was violating both Chinese and Burkinabe law. Furthermore, Traoré continued, the seized documents show that this was a criminal enterprise, not a legitimate business operation. Dragon Pearl was paying bribes to government officials and systematically harvesting protected species without legal authorization. The Chinese officials exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the detailed evidence Traoré was presenting. Their position would be much stronger if they could claim ignorance of the illegal nature of the operation, but the documented evidence made such claims untenable. "We appreciate your government's position," the attaché replied carefully. "However, we hope this matter can be resolved without affecting broader Chinese-Burkinabe economic cooperation." The implicit threat was clear. China was Burkina Faso's largest source of infrastructure investment and development funding. Antagonizing Chinese commercial interests could have serious consequences for projects that employed thousands of Burkinabe workers and provided critical improvements to roads, schools, and hospitals. China's legitimate investments in Burkina Faso are welcome and valued, Traoré responded firmly. But they cannot be used to shield criminal activity or environmental destruction. We look forward to continuing our partnership with Chinese companies that operate within the law. The meeting concluded with diplomatic politeness, but clear underlying tension. Traoré had successfully avoided making any concessions regarding the arrested personnel or seized timber, but he was also aware that Chinese pressure would likely intensify in the coming days. That evening brought even more concerning news. Ranger Ouedraogo, who had remained in Ouagadougou to provide additional testimony about the illegal logging operation, reported that he was being followed by unknown individuals. More ominously, two other rangers who had provided information about environmental crimes had been threatened with transfer to remote postings if they continued their cooperation with the investigation. "They're trying to isolate our sources and intimidate witnesses," Traoré concluded after hearing Ouedraogo's report, "which means they're desperate to prevent further revelations." The pattern was consistent with major corruption scandals. Once the initial evidence became public, those involved typically focused on damage control, suppressing additional evidence, intimidating witnesses, and attempting to discredit the investigation itself. "Sir," Captain Dao entered with an urgent report. "We've intercepted communication suggesting that supporters of those we arrested are planning to claim that the convoy interception was actually a robbery, and that you're planning to sell the timber for personal profit." It was a predictable but dangerous accusation. By portraying the law enforcement action as criminal activity, corrupt officials could attempt to shift public opinion and undermine the legitimacy of the entire investigation. Traoré made an immediate decision that surprised his advisors. "Tomorrow morning, we're taking the seized timber to the central marketplace in Ouagadougou. I want every citizen to see exactly what was being stolen from our country." The following morning, 17 massive trucks carrying illegal timber made a slow procession through the streets of Ouagadougou. Traoré had ordered that the convoy follow the most public route possible, allowing thousands of citizens to witness firsthand the scale of environmental crime that had been intercepted. The impact was immediate and profound. Crowds gathered along the route, many of them seeing such massive hardwood logs for the first time in their lives. The sight of centuries-old trees reduced to cargo for export sparked widespread anger and amazement. People began following the convoy, creating an impromptu parade that grew larger as it moved through the city. At the central marketplace, Traoré had arranged for forestry experts and university professors to explain the significance of what citizens were seeing. Dr. Aminata Ouedraogo, a respected botanist from the University of Ouagadougou, addressed the growing crowd. "These African blackwood logs," she explained, pointing to the dark, dense timber, came from trees that were likely over 200 years old. They survived the slave trade, colonial rule, independence, and decades of drought. Each tree was a living monument to our natural heritage. The crowd listened intently as she continued. "This single truck carries timber worth more than most villages see in an entire year. Yet the communities where these trees grew received nothing for their loss, no compensation, No consultation, no consideration of their rights or needs. Traoré then addressed the assembled citizens, speaking in Moor, Dioula, and French to ensure his message reached everyone present. What you see here represents not just theft of timber, but theft of your inheritance and your children's future. These trees provided habitat for wildlife, prevented soil erosion, influenced rainfall patterns, and offered shade and shelter for generations of our people. He gestured toward the massive logs. This cargo was destined for luxury furniture in foreign countries, while our children lacked desks in their schools and our hospitals lacked basic equipment. The profits were going to corrupt officials and international criminals, not to the Burkina people who are the rightful owners of these resources. The crowd's response was electric. Spontaneous chants began, "Justice for our forests!" and "Down with corruption." People who had never engaged in political activism found themselves moved to action by the tangible evidence of environmental crime and official betrayal. Local media captured every moment, ensuring that the images of massive logs and outraged citizens would reach every corner of the country. Social media amplified the message further, with photographs and videos spreading rapidly across West Africa and beyond. But Traoré's boldest move was yet to come. Standing before the timber-laden trucks, he made an announcement that surprised even his closest advisors. "Tomorrow, we will begin the process of returning these logs to the earth from which they came," he declared. "Rather than selling them and perpetuating the cycle of exploitation, we will use them to create a national monument to environmental protection and the fight against corruption." The decision was economically costly but symbolically powerful. By refusing to profit from the seized timber, Traoré was demonstrating that his actions were motivated by principle rather than personal gain. The monument would serve as a permanent reminder of what had been recovered and what still needed protection. The public display of seized timber and the massive citizen response it generated represented a significant victory for Traoré, but it also provoked an equally significant counterattack from the corruption network. By evening, General Tay had made his move. "Sir," Lieutenant Konate burst into Traoré's office with alarming news. "General Tay has issued orders restricting your access to military communications and transportation. He's claiming that your authority as interim president doesn't extend to autonomous military operations." The challenge was both legal and practical. While Traoré held the office of president, his legitimacy depended largely on military support. If General Tay could convince enough senior officers that Traoré was overstepping his authority, it could trigger a military coup that would remove him from power and likely end any investigation of environmental crimes. "What's the response from other commanders?" Traoré asked. "Mixed, sir. Several regional commanders have expressed support for your actions, particularly after seeing the public reaction today. But others are concerned about the precedent of military operations against civilian officials without formal cabinet approval. It was a constitutional crisis in the making. Burkina Faso's political system had always struggled with questions of civilian military authority, and the timber smuggling investigation had pushed those tensions to a breaking point. Major Sanu entered with additional intelligence that clarified the situation. "Sir, we've completed the financial investigation of General Tay. He's been receiving regular payments from Dragon Pearl Enterprises through a series of shell companies based in Dubai. Total payments over the past 2 years exceed 400 million CFA francs. The revelation was devastating but not surprising. General Tay's opposition to the convoy interception was motivated by his own criminal involvement in the timber smuggling network. His attempts to undermine Traoré's authority were essentially an effort to protect his own illegal activities. This changes everything, Traoré realized. We're not just dealing with environmental crime. We're dealing with systematic corruption that reaches the highest levels of military command. The implications were staggering. If the most senior military officer in Burkina Faso was compromised by involvement in international smuggling networks, how many other crucial positions were similarly corrupted? The country's entire security apparatus could be infiltrated by criminal organizations. "Sir," Captain Dao entered with urgent news. "Our surveillance teams report that General Tay is meeting tonight with several Chinese businessmen at a private residence in the diplomatic quarter." Chen Wei's associates, who weren't arrested in the convoy operation. The meeting suggested that the corruption network was regrouping and planning their response to Traoré's investigation. Most concerning was the involvement of Chinese nationals who had avoided arrest. They represented the international connections that could provide both financial resources and political pressure to undermine the anti-corruption campaign. Traoré made a decision that would define his presidency. "We're going to arrest General Tay tonight." The statement stunned his advisors. Arresting the country's senior military commander was an unprecedented action that could trigger a military revolt or even civil war. However, allowing him to continue operating while compromised by criminal connections posed an even greater threat to national security. "Sir," Major Sanu protested, "that's an enormous risk. If it goes wrong, we could face a military uprising that would destroy the government. If we don't act, we face the certainty that corruption will continue to undermine every aspect of governance," Traoré replied firmly. "General Tay's criminal involvement makes him a threat to national security that we cannot ignore. The operation to arrest General Tay required careful planning and absolute secrecy. Only the most trusted officers could be involved. And the arrest would need to occur simultaneously with the seizure of evidence from his residence and office. We move at 0200 hours, Traoré decided. Simultaneous teams at his home, office, and the meeting location. Full documentation of everything we find, and immediate security for all arrested personnel. As his team prepared for what could be the most consequential operation of his presidency, Traoré reflected on how far they had come since Ranger Ouedraogo first arrived with evidence of illegal logging. What had begun as environmental crime, investigation had evolved into a comprehensive battle against corruption that threatened the very foundations of Burkinabe governance. The night arrest. Operation proceeded with military precision. General Tay was taken into custody without resistance, apparently confident that his position and connections would protect him from serious consequences. His Chinese associates were also arrested, along with substantial evidence of the financial relationships between military officials and international timber smuggling networks. The evidence seized from General Tay's properties exceeded even Traoré's expectations. Bank records, communications logs, and shipping documents revealed corruption on a scale that dwarfed the initial convoy interception. The timber smuggling operation was just one component of a broader criminal enterprise that included drug trafficking, arms dealing, and money laundering. "Sir," Major Sanu reported as they reviewed the seized materials, "this network has been operating for over 5 years. They've moved hundreds of millions of dollars through Burkina Faso, using our country as a transit point for international criminal organizations." The scale of the discovery was both overwhelming and clarifying. The environmental crimes that had initially motivated their investigation were part of a much larger pattern of exploitation that threatened Burkina Faso's sovereignty and security. Word of General. Tay's arrest spread quickly through diplomatic channels, generating responses from multiple foreign governments and international organizations. The Chinese embassy expressed formal concern about the arrest of Chinese nationals, while the European Union issued a statement supporting Burkina Faso's efforts to combat environmental crime and corruption. Most significantly, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reached out to offer assistance with the investigation of international trafficking networks. The evidence seized from General Tay and his associates had implications that extended far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Captain Traoré, the UNODC representative explained during a secure video conference, "Your investigation has uncovered connections to trafficking networks that we've been monitoring across West Africa. The intelligence you've gathered could help dismantle operations in multiple countries." The international dimension of the case provided both opportunities and challenges. While international cooperation could strengthen the investigation and increase pressure on corrupt officials, it also raised questions about sovereignty and the extent to which foreign organizations should be involved in Burkina Faso's internal affairs. "We welcome technical assistance and intelligence sharing," Traoré responded carefully, "but the investigation and prosecution must remain under Burkinabe jurisdiction. We won't allow our sovereignty to be compromised, even in the pursuit of justice." The balance between international cooperation and national independence would prove crucial in the coming months. Burkina Faso needed foreign assistance to fully understand and combat the international networks involved in environmental crime, but excessive foreign involvement could undermine the legitimacy of the entire process. Meanwhile, the domestic political situation continued to evolve rapidly. General Tay's arrest had eliminated the most serious threat to Traoré's authority, but it had also created a leadership vacuum in the military hierarchy that needed to be filled carefully. Colonel Umaru, the most senior officer not implicated in corruption, was promoted to temporary command of the military. A career soldier with an impeccable record, he had been among the first to support Traoré's environmental protection efforts and had provided crucial intelligence about corrupt officers. "Sir," Colonel Umaru reported during his first briefing as acting military commander, "morale among the officer corps is actually improving since General Tay's arrest. Most officers are relieved that corruption is finally being addressed seriously." The response suggested that the corruption had been more damaging to military effectiveness than previously understood. Officers who had tried to maintain professional standards while watching their superiors profit from criminal activity were finally seeing justice being served. 3 months after the convoy interception, Traoré stood in a cleared area on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, where construction was beginning on the National Forest Heritage Monument. The seized timber logs, rather than being sold, would be arranged in a powerful artistic display designed by Burkina Faso's most respected sculptors and architects. This monument will remind future generations of what we almost lost and what we must continue to protect, Traoré explained to the gathered crowd of officials, journalists, and citizens. Each log represents not just a tree, but an entire ecosystem that took centuries to develop. The monument design was both beautiful and educational. The massive logs would be arranged to recreate a forest grove, with interpretive materials explaining the ecological role of each species and the communities that had depended on them. Interactive displays would allow visitors to understand the connections between forest health and human welfare. Ranger Ouedraogo, whose courage in bringing the initial evidence had made the entire investigation possible, was chosen to plant the first tree in the memorial garden that would surround the monument. The young sapling, an African blackwood grown from seeds, collected in the eastern forests, represented hope for environmental recovery and regeneration. "This tree will grow slowly," Ouedraogo said as he carefully placed the seedling in the prepared soil. "It may take 50 years or more to reach maturity, but if we protect it and others like it, our children will see the return of the forests that sustained our ancestors." The ceremony was attended by representatives from across Burkinabe society, traditional chiefs, religious leaders, students, farmers, and urban professionals. The diversity of the gathering reflected the broad public support that had emerged for environmental protection and anti-corruption efforts. International observers were also present, including representatives from the United Nations, the African Union, and several European governments. Their presence demonstrated the global significance of Burkina Faso's efforts to combat environmental crime and corruption. "What you have accomplished here serves as a model for other countries facing similar challenges," the European Union's environmental attaché observed. "By linking environmental protection with governance reform, you've created a framework that addresses root causes rather than just symptoms." 1 year after the convoy interception, the impact of Traoré's environmental protection initiative could be measured in multiple ways. Over 200 officials had been prosecuted for involvement in environmental crimes, resulting in the recovery of hundreds of millions of CFA francs in stolen assets. More importantly, illegal logging had decreased dramatically as enhanced enforcement and community monitoring made such operations increasingly difficult to sustain. The reforestation program had planted over 2 million trees across the eastern forests, with communities taking active roles in protecting and nurturing the new growth. Ranger stations had been reinforced and equipped with modern surveillance technology, making it much harder for illegal operations to go undetected. Perhaps most significantly, the investigation had sparked a broader transformation in governance and public engagement. Citizens who had once accepted corruption as inevitable were now actively reporting suspicious activities and demanding accountability from their leaders. The convoy interception was just the beginning. Traoré reflected during an interview with international journalists. The real victory is the change in how people think about their relationship with natural resources and government authority. The success had not come without costs. Several investigations were ongoing into attempts to assassinate key witnesses, and international criminal networks continued to probe for weaknesses in Burkina Faso's reformed enforcement systems. The battle against environmental crime required constant vigilance and adaptation to new threats, but the foundations had been established for lasting change. Legal reforms had strengthened environmental protection laws and increased penalties for violations. International partnerships had improved intelligence sharing and coordination with neighboring countries. Community engagement had created thousands of local guardians committed to protecting their natural heritage. 5 years later, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood in the same eastern forest where Ranger Ouedraogo had first discovered evidence of illegal logging. The devastated clear-cuts had been replanted and were showing encouraging signs of recovery. Young trees, still small but healthy, created patches of green in areas that had once been barren. "The trees remember," Ouedraogo explained as they walked through the recovering forest. "The root systems and soil communities survived the cutting, and they're helping the new growth establish itself more quickly than we had hoped." The ecological recovery was paralleled by social and economic improvements in the surrounding communities. The reforestation program had provided employment for hundreds of local people, while community forest management initiatives had created sustainable sources of income from non-timber forest products. Children from nearby villages regularly visited the forest as part of environmental education programs, learning about the connections between healthy ecosystems and human welfare. Many of them had committed to becoming the next generation of forest guardians, carrying forward the work that had begun with the interception of a single convoy of stolen timber. The National Forest Heritage Monument in Ouagadougou had become one of the country's most visited sites, drawing both domestic and international visitors who wanted to understand Burkina Faso's journey from environmental exploitation to protection and regeneration. The massive logs, now weathered and aged, served as powerful reminders of what could be lost and what could be saved through determined action. International recognition had followed. Traoré received awards from environmental organizations worldwide, and Burkina Faso's anti-corruption and forest protection programs had been replicated in several other African countries. The model of linking environmental protection with governance reform had proven effective beyond their borders. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. A delegation of children from Nabariga village, the community where Traoré had first witnessed the human cost of deforestation, presented him with a handmade book containing drawings of the forests they hoped to see restored in their lifetime. "We want to see the elephants come back," explained Fatima, a 10-year-old girl whose grandmother had told her stories of wildlife that had once lived in their forests. "And we want our children to play under trees as big as the ones in the old stories." The drawings showed vibrant forests filled with wildlife, clear streams flowing year-round, and communities living in harmony with abundant natural resources. They represented not just hope, but commitment to making such visions reality. As Traoré accepted the book, he felt the weight of responsibility that had driven him since that early morning when Ranger Ouedraogo first knocked on his office door. The battle for Burkina Faso's forests had been won, but the war for sustainable development and environmental justice continued. The seeds planted, in those early days of crisis and confrontation, had grown into something larger than anyone had initially envisioned. What began as an effort to stop illegal logging had evolved into a comprehensive transformation of how Burkina Faso approached natural resource management, governance, and international cooperation. The convoy had been stopped. The forests were returning, and the children were learning to be guardians of the natural heritage that would sustain their nation for generations to come. Standing in the recovering forest, listening to the sounds of birds and insects that had returned to once silent areas, Traoré understood that their greatest victory was not measured in timber seized or officials prosecuted, but in the restoration of hope that human communities could live sustainably with their environment, that corruption could be overcome through determined action, and that the choices made by one generation could create opportunities for all those who would follow. The forest remembered. The people remembered, and the future remained bright with possibility.